joining us. She is the president of Asymmetrica. Vanessa Neumann, a dual citizen. She's from Venezuela. She studied this for a long time, lived there, is very active there in the political scene. She's also an expert on all of South America. Vanessa Neumann, great to have you with us again.
Great. Thank you for having me on. And Venezuela's situation is like, you miss an hour, you miss a lot. It's a bit like pass the popcorn at the moment. It's not boring. It's a little confusing for, unless you're up to your eyeballs in it the way I am, tracking it minute by minute, then, for the casual observer, you're like, what is going on? There's been, I'm still here in New York City. I came up, I did a bunch of stuff with, Fox and other interviews because circling around the Security Council meeting that Pompeo called. Highly unusual for the Security Council to meet on a Saturday morning. That really sent a signal of this is important, and also sent the signal of Pompeo's strength. It's like, we're doing this Saturday at 9 a.m. and you're all going to be there. And they were. So, of course, Russia and China did their usual of America is intervening, and Maduro is and Maduro is the president, etc. But to your question of why Trump is doing this, there's a number of reasons, and we're very grateful that we are. And as you said, because I'm a dual citizen, I'm sort of my heart is on both sides of this issue, right? Pro-U.S. and pro-democracy in Venezuela. So I think Pompeo has made it clear, and Pence made it clear in a video, that the U.S. has stood by for too long. The world, not just the U.S., the world has observed for too long tens of thousands of people who have been killed in extrajudicial killings, which means assassinations for being opposition, a country that's starving, that's 97, should be the wealthiest country on earth, and it was, when I was a child, one of the wealthiest countries on earth. And now it has gone from there to 97% poverty. 2/3 of people can't find enough to eat. They're fleeing. Babies are dying by the hour because you don't have enough medicine. And it's just become a humanitarian disaster. And they're harboring terrorist groups, organized crime groups. They're the number one source of transportation or transit point for cocaine into the United States and into Central America. So if you're concerned about those migrants coming from Central America, that violence is being fueled by the drugs that are being transported out of Venezuela. If you're concerned about drugs, you need to be supportive of getting rid of the Maduro regime. And so to add to all of those concerns, that Venezuela has basically become a security threat to the entire region, on the one hand. On the other hand, the terrible violations of human rights and the desperate situation of the people. You had a perfect constitutional moment that happened when suddenly Maduro's legitimate presidency ran out, and nobody had recognized his previous election, what he called an election from last May, except, of course, the money laundering criminal countries that are not democracies, who are sort of in bed with him. And they said, look, according to the Constitution, which these guys wrote, there's this new guy who is the president of the National Assembly, and the presidency falls to him, kind of like a Speaker of the House situation, right? So if you don't have a president or a vice president, then the Speaker of the House has to step in and assume the presidency. Same thing. And the Americans said, here's our chance, here's our chance to help the Venezuelan people. We don't have to do really much. It's not intervening with military. You're not putting boots on the ground. You're not endangering American lives. You're just supporting them diplomatically and doing the right thing that's in keeping with the law, in keeping even with Venezuela's law and with international law. So it's a brilliant move, really, for the Trump administration. And I think it's going to go down in history as one of their big wins.
Well, again, we don't know what intel they have. And to Congressman Riggleman's point earlier, he said to me, and he was honest, he said, look, we're going to get an intel briefing on this in the next day or so, and I'll have more information then. He said, right now, I'm just going on what everybody else is going on in the news. We just don't know. So obviously, they've got more information. But I agree with you. I think it was the right thing to do, although I'm not in favor of these type of interventions. There's exceptions to every rule. That's why you have to govern. But Vanessa Neumann, let me ask you this. What is the pathway here? Because most of his generals have come out backing him over the last several days. So, short of some kind of a military coup, which you had said would bubble up from lieutenants and colonels, not the generals. I mean, what is the pathway of removing him from power?
Oh, well, it's hard to predict because there's always, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, as in these political scenarios. What I can tell you is, there are certain different possibilities, and what exactly happens depends on dynamics that some people can know, and some things nobody will ever know. But basically, what has happened is, while most of the generals have supported him, very importantly was that over the weekend, I think it was actually the same day as the Security Council meeting, because I remember we were sort of celebrating it by having some Venezuelan food with some of the activists who were protesting in favor of the U.S.
Right.
Outside the UN, saying, thank you, please help us. And we got notice that the colonel, who is the military attaché of the Venezuelan military, which at the embassy in Washington, which every embassy has these guys, you always have a military attaché, flipped. And he sent out a video saying that he is backing Guaido, which is the opposition, and urging the rest of the military to do the same. Presumably now can't go back to Caracas, but Madura has asked for them all to come back home. And he said, not only am I not going back home, I'm going to issue an order to the rest of the military to follow me and flip sides. We think, or our intelligence suggests, that there are more people who will flip. It's one of those things. It's a little bit like an avalanche. You kind of need a certain amount of center of gravity for it to flip. Because what happens is you start getting into what we call a prisoner's dilemma situation, which is like when you negotiate with the cops and you're like, we've got your partner in the other room and he's telling us everything, and you don't know whether he is or not. Like, you want to be the one who makes, that's what's called prisoner's dilemma, right? You want to make the first deal. You want to make sure you make the first deal. So that's why the cops are like, lie to you and be like, yeah, he's spilling his guts, to make you to spill your guts and flip. And it's a buyer's market. I mean, there's so many people that we can work on trying changing their minds. And then following on from that, the other thing that was really important, it's really muscular, and it came out last night, is that the Venezuelan government, first of all, named an ambassador to the interim ambassador to the U.S., which is the right-hand man of Guaido, has been for a very long time, for many years. This is interim. There'll be a change of guard once there's an election later on. And then you have and an ambassador to the OAS, which is very important because they're in charge of Western Hemisphere stuff. And then soon after that, the U.S. government announced that all the bank accounts that belong to Maduro and the Venezuelan government that are in the U.S. are frozen and being given over to the opposition. So what the path here basically is increased diplomacy, increased pressure on more countries recognizing Guaido. Israel and Australia joined the fray yesterday as well. So you have more countries recognizing Guaido, and that means that they are taking in the ambassadors of the opposition, and that means that they are also taking in, handing over the bank accounts. Once these guys can't get paid, they're going to flip. Or if they can't get paid and they don't flip, the ones who do want to flip are going to take matters into their own hands with the ones who are holding them back. The pressure is increasing, and this will crack one way or another. Because and I don't see what can be done. I mean, what are you going to do? Massacre people?
Right.
That might help. I mean, that might be something they do, but that's not really going to help matters in the longer term. You have Brazil that already has its military on the border with Venezuela, sent them there over the weekend for humanitarian purposes, but, that would be ill-advised. So they're running out of options, they're running out of money, they're running out of credibility.
Incredible. So Maduro's government is still in charge, right, today? I mean, they still run the country, right, now?
Yeah, they run it internally. But with the loss of those international bank accounts, they're just basically going to have to continue dealing drugs or something. I mean, and then, once all you do is deal drugs, that's a whole other matter.
Well, why would they have...
That opens up a whole other issue.
Well, I think that's one of the issues why the Trump administration has taken this route, because of the drug aspect that's involved here. But why would the Maduro government have named an interim ambassador to the U.S. who was an ally of Guaido's?
Oh, no. Oh, no, the Maduro government didn't. The interim president, Guaido, named his ambassador.
So he named his ambassador,
his guy.
Which the U.S. is supporting.
His own person.
Right.
So the U.S. and Venezuela have not had an ambassador for years because they hate the Americans, right? I mean, these guys hate the U.S. So they kicked out the U.S. ambassador years ago, and the U.S., it's the sort of what we call diplomatic parity, otherwise known as tit for tat, kicked out the Venezuelan ambassador. So you've only had something called a chargé d'affaires, which is it's a diplomatic term for someone a bit below an ambassador. So now that once the U.S. says Maduro's not the legitimate government, Guaido is, then you turn to Guaido and you say, send us your ambassador. And he's not an ambassador. He's, again, at that level of chargé d'affaires.
Career diplomat.
Sort of the guy who's sort of filling in for an ambassador.
Right.
So that means that they're operating, Guaido is our government is in direct and daily contact diplomatically, officially, with the U.S. government.
So
it's a big, big deal.
All right. So basically, because the U.S. recognized Guaido, he then sent an interim ambassador to the United States, and that position has been empty because Venezuela didn't send one because we have bad relations. We don't have one there, vice versa. It's been run by careerists for the U.S. and diplomatic corps and vice versa. So now we've got an actual ambassador interim in the United States representing.
Well, we have a chargé d'affaires, which is a step below an ambassador.
Right, chargé d'affaires.
I presume he'll be made an ambassador later on, but for that, then the U.S. has to appoint an ambassador to Venezuela, and we might have to wait until Maduro's out for that.
So what about Maduro?
It's a little bit insider baseball of diplomatic stuff, but it signals to the world that Guaido's the one you have to do business with.
So
but giving him a show, but this guy's going to live in Washington D.C. in the embassy.
Right. So what about Maduro saying you've got 70? What about Maduro telling the U.S. they had 72 hours to get their diplomatic team out of Venezuela? Now that 72 hours has passed. They're still there.
Yes.
So what?
Correct. So what was so that was really that actually made for some wry amusement. Maybe you don't find it. I mean, it's kind of not funny, but it made for a lot of wry commentary on what would happen, because they said, if we were back in Guaido, we're shutting the embassy and you're kicked out. So the Americans rightly said, you can't kick us out because we don't recognize you as president. Guaido is president, and Guaido wants us to stay. Guaido says the Americans can stay. So he said, so they said, we're listening to him, not to you. It's not your place to kick us out. So then the real Diosdado Cabello, who's like the number 2 in the regime and is a real thug, said, well, maybe the water and the electricity and the and the gas will be cut off to the American embassy, basically threatening a siege, right, of the American staff. So, we said, oh, yeah, you go try that with the Americans. And he said, and if you don't leave, we'll sort of drag you out. So we were commenting like, right, who's going to be the guy who knocks on the door with a gun and tries to drag Americans out of the building? Because this I got to see, okay? Because the Americans aren't going to take very kindly to that, okay? I mean, we still are the biggest military force in the world, right? So Anyway, so then they backed down. They said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to kick out the Americans. The Americans did evacuate their non-essential personnel, right? So spouses or their spouses and people in more sort of admin roles. But they're still functioning as an embassy and as a consulate because they need to attend to the American citizens who live and work down there. I mean, there's still Americans there. So they need to be protected and attended to. So it's interesting because they've basically, the Madura regime has backed down and they've shown their weakness in a number of ways. Guaido's increasing legitimacy, and there's not much they can do about it.
Vanessa Neumann,
and they're not kicking out the Americans. The only option is force.
Right. That's over.
And to lay siege to the American embassy with a bunch of guns is not going to end well for them,
it's not
for the
gonna
Maduro regime.
They have basically the Maduro regime here. Their days are numbered. They have very limited options. Once they run out of money, it's over, right? Because then, like you say, they can't paying so many people from their illegal drug trade or whatever. Once that money dries up and these people can't get paid, that's their only allegiance. This whole thing is going to collapse. I think it's a matter of days, not weeks, perhaps, right?
I hope so. It's, as I say, it's hard to tell. These things, it's really hard to tell. I mean, for instance, the fall of the Berlin Wall, nobody saw that coming. Right. There was not a single report that was about to happen.
Right.
And basically going back in history, that was one soldier, one guard at the wall who said, let them come, who saw the people starting to amass. And he said, let them come. And once word got out that they were crossing, then you got a whole flood of people and the Berlin Wall came down. So what I'm saying is that in these things where you have real change from one situation to another, often it turns on something small that other people don't see or are unforeseeable. So what I can foresee is that I don't think that this can really be stopped very, very well. Not with the more countries, not with the bank accounts being frozen, not with the ambassador corps growing. Everybody wants it to be as bloodless as possible. Nobody wants the Maduro regime to fight back and kill people, and that would be the military. So I think we're on a good path. But I think they'll dig in, and how quickly it ends, we don't know. But let's pray. Let's pray for the Americans down there and the Venezuelans that this nightmare ends sooner and they transition back to a democracy and prosperity.
We're out of time. I want to thank Vanessa Neumann for sharing that perspective with us. Asymmetrica. She's the president of Asymmetrica. She's a dual Venezuelan U.S. citizen, very knowledgeable about the area. We saw you on Fox News Sunday. You were fantastic. Vanessa, thanks for being with us. Yeah, you were just great on, I think it was Neil Cavuto, I believe. You were absolutely fantastic. Great job.